Hi, everybody. This is Carol Mirabin. We'll be starting in approximately 2 minutes. So just wanted to let you know that we're here and excited to see you. Thanks. Hi, everybody. My name is Carol Mirabin, and I am co-chair of Friends of Contemporary Art and Photography Steering Committee. I'd like to thank those that made tonight's program possible. Thanks to the FOCAP Steering Committee, especially Liz Cruz. Thanks to the Museum of New Mexico Foundation, especially Kristen Graham. Thanks to Karsten Creightney and Phillis Ideal for being part of tonight's program. And a huge shout out and thank you to the New Mexico Museum of Art staff, especially Merry Scully, for successfully curating another wonderful Alcoves exhibition and for moderating tonight's discussion. Tonight begins our gallery conversation webinar series. Alcoves number 4 is the latest in the Alcove series, and you can now view the exhibition in person since the Museum of Art has reopened. But since we can't be there as a group to have the regular gallery conversation with the artists, we're happy to bring you 2 of the artists from the new exhibition. The Alcove series consists of rotating exhibitions every few years focused on new work by contemporary New Mexico artists. Since it was relaunched in 2012, 90 New Mexican artists have exhibited their work. The series is curated by Merry Scully, the Museum of Art's curator of contemporary art, and follows a format which derives from the founding of the New Mexico Museum of Art in 1917. FOCAP is a sponsor of Alcoves exhibitions and programs. So that means that your dues support this amazing series. If you are not already a member of FOCAP, please consider becoming a member. If you are already a member, thank you so very much for your involvement and your support. Before we begin tonight's program, I'd like to preview the April Gallery Conversations program, which will take place Tuesday, April 6th at 5:30 p.m. So please mark your calendar. Amy Ellingson received a BA in Studio Art from Scripps College and an MFA from Cal Arts. Amy's public commission, Untitled Large Variation, is an 1,100, I almost said 11,000, is an 1,100 square foot ceramic mosaic mural and is a permanent installation in Terminal 3 of the San Francisco International Airport. Amy is a native of the San Francisco Bay Area. She currently lives and works in Santa Fe. Deborah Baxter is a sculptor and jewelry designer who combines carved alabaster with crystals, minerals, metals, and found objects. Amy received her MFA in sculpture from Bard College and her BFA from Minneapolis College of Art and Design. Tonight's program will feature two painters from the new Alcove series. Karsten Creightney is a professor of printmaking at UNM, where he completed the Tamarind Institute Master Printers program and received a Master of Fine Arts in Painting. Phillis Ideal received a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from the University of New Mexico and later a master's degree in counseling from New York University. She also holds a Master of Fine Arts from the University of California, Berkeley. The program tonight will be a moderated discussion led by Merry Scully. You can submit your questions at any time during the program using the Q&A icon. I'll see you again at the end of the discussion to help with Q&A. And now let's welcome tonight's panelists.
Hello, I hope everybody can see my slides, or the slide. I'm Merry Scully, and I want to echo all of Carol's thank yous. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can bring Karsten and Phillis up on the screen so everybody can see them. Thank you so much, Karsten and Phillis, for agreeing to do this evening. The Alcoves is one of the most popular programs that I participate in at the museum. And one of the traditions of that is to have these informal gallery conversations with artists from the Alcove exhibitions. We are going to do our best to mimic that format tonight, and I want to encourage the audience to think about questions and to type things into the chat. We'll start with a little bit of a description by each artist about their work. The artists and I may chime in on each other's presentations, but the Alcove exhibitions are really 5 one-person shows at a time. So we really, when we do the in-gallery conversation, we talk with each artist individually, encouraging exchange, and then move on to each alcove. So we're going to try and mimic that tonight by having a little conversation with each artist first, and then engaging in what we hope will be a very exciting conversation. This is the last in this rotation of alcoves. But since 2013, we featured 95 New Mexico-based artists in these Alcove exhibitions, which is great. And that just shows the wealth of artistic talent we have within our state. So without further delay, I want to introduce Karsten Creightney, who actually I met the first time on a FOCAP tour to Gallery 208, or Exhibits 208 down in Albuquerque. And now I'm going to switch over to the slides so we can look a little bit at the installation in the gallery, and hopefully everybody will go in person to see it as well. But let's get into the shared screen. And here we go. This is an overall view of the Alcove installation. And then hopefully it will let me go on to the next slide. That's not a good sign. Let me try resharing and see if that will help. Okay, do we good? Can people see Karsten's work now? Great. So thank you so much. And what I can do is just drive a little bit. Why don't I show the overview? And then you can tell me which slides you want to see or when I should stop. Okay. So Karsten and Phillis are both native New Mexicans originally. So there's a place to start.
Yeah. Well, hello. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. It's certainly my pleasure and honor to talk a little bit about my work. I consider myself a collage artist. I have a background in printmaking. Like Mary said, I went to the Tamarind Institute, studied lithography, and then branched out to other types of printmaking. And right away, I started wanting to use these things that I created on paper. I wanted to cut them up and reassemble them. And I found a lot of inspiration going, back in art history to, 100 years to sort of the end of the Industrial Revolution, the dawn of modern art, and the artists we think of now as the Cubists. So for, collage as an art form is credited to these European artists, these, big names like Picasso and Braque. And I think what made their work so revolutionary was there was a time where painting was all about perception. It was about, observing your environment and recreating it. And the collage artists, the Cubists, really started to break that down and tried to make it about imagination. So it was no longer about perception, but it was more about sort of inventing the world that you wanted to see. And I think that in combination with my love of the material of paper has been this driving force in my work. I find it really inspiring to sort of create an invented world out of fragments. And I will start, talking a little bit about the work that I did in the past. And then toward the end of our slideshow, I'll start to talk a little bit more about the work that's actually in the exhibition. But the work that you see now on your screen is an older, it's about 4 years old, painting that I did. And, it's totally invented space that I created in my mind that's composed of prints and painting. And a lot of what I try to do is it was like smash everything together into one piece of art, whether it's something I cut out of a book, some piece of paint, or a printed snippet that I've created or that I found. I like combining everything and getting it to work so that it is once simultaneously sort of a bunch of pieces, but that there's sort of this structure that holds it all together. And I think that's really at the heart of what I do. And I think that there's a lot of similarities with the Cubists of old. I think they were responding to a time where the world had really changed, and it's like, how do you make meaning in a world where there's all this like flood of new information? That time it was like newspapers were everywhere. There was this flood of just printed material, and so the artists started to put that in their work. And so for me, we are now in a new revolution, not the sort of tail end of the Industrial Revolution, but sort of the beginning or the middle of the digital revolution, right? The information age, where we too now are bombarded with like this flood of information. And I think that what I'm trying to do is sort of make sense of, what is painting at a time where, something as slow as a painting has to happen while we're just sort of constantly bombarded with all this stuff, And so for me, the answer has been to sort of cut up that stuff and reassemble it and try to make my own story.
Right. I think it's interesting that you would bring up the Cubists, because I see, particularly in this painting, and we'll move on to the others, so much post-impressionism. It's like Cézanne's Oranges and Mount Saint Victoire had a baby. It's like a mashup of those things. The other thing is, I think what's interesting with the digital age is, while so many things are electronic, there's more paper than ever.
Yeah, that's true. There's more disposable stuff now than ever. I mean, we truly live in a disposable world. I mean, just go to buy lunch and you just like 14 pieces of packaging on everything,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want me to go to the next slide?
Sure. Yeah, sure. So I originally started doing landscapes, this painting and the painting before are composed of fragments, but really at this time, I was really concerned with trying to make those fragments have a real structure and a sensibility so that you could see that perceived sense of space. So even though I'm inventing this thing and it's not necessarily about perception, it's about invention, it's still really about the sort of foreground, middle ground, background, this idea of, you know, a space that you would recognize. So, you know, although this is composed of paint and some printed matter and largely just stuff I've cut out of books, this painting is actually in the collection of the Albuquerque Museum now, and sometimes on view. So if you ever guys come down to Albuquerque, you can see it there. It's largely cut from, you know, large picture books like National Geographic, you know, large books, because it's large in scale. It's like almost 6 feet by 5 feet or something like that. And for me, it was like real important to get this thing that is composed of all these little flat individual pieces to sort of hang together as a whole. There is this sort of aha moment for me that happens, sort of like putting the last piece in a jigsaw puzzle, where it's sort of the full picture sort of is there, and even though it's composed of a bunch of little fragments, it hangs together. And for a long time, that was the sort of guiding force. Like I wanted to get all these fragments to sort of coexist and make something that looked almost like painted, or almost had like a photographic feel to it. But I started to get more jazzed by like the moments in the painting where that would start to break down, and it would start to just really be about the scraps. It would really start to be about the fragments. And I found that that was a more open-ended place for me to work. And it was less about like really trying to get these things to sort of behave, and it was more about giving them a life of their own. So maybe we could go to the next slide.
Karsten, before you leave this one, we do have a question.
Yeah.
Someone, one of our attendees, is curious how you select the fragments that you use in the paintings.
Well, you know, part of it is like, you know, I think there's like a hoarder, a little hoarder in me somewhere. I love like the hunt. You know? So part of it is like pouring over the like thrift stores. You know, Mary was saying there's more paper than ever now, and that's really a part of it. It's like there's so much material, disposable material. And one thing that I really like is to take something that's sort of disposable and make it precious. So I will just like go through books, you know, large picture books, and just tear stuff out of the books and cut it up, and then like hold it up to the painting and see if it works, and then collage it in, you know? So it's very much a sort of a trial and error. These things become documents of their own making. I don't quite know what's gonna work. It's not like I work from this preconceived idea. It's more that I follow the work. I see what works and then go from there. And so that's kind of how I work. You know, I have just bookshelves on bookshelves of material that I've gleaned from bookstores, thrift stores, and then I constantly, since I'm a printmaker and I teach printmaking, I'm constantly making imagery too. So like the images, the imagery in this painting that you see up on your screen now are largely printed by me. So unlike the past image, which was largely stuff ripped out of books, this is like actually like woodcuts and linoleum cuts that I've made, as well as the background figures, the Apaches that are standing on the horizon there. That's taken from a very famous historical photo of Geronimo and his men the day before he surrendered. And so I've taken this iconic historical photo, I've reproduced it as a lithograph, and blown it up, printed it on Japanese papers, cut that up, and then reassembled that on the canvas, to create my own story, my own world. And so whether I'm working with material that I create or material that I find in books, it's like using this found material as my, as my paint, and then, sometimes it's too disjointed. And so then paint becomes a way to sort of tie it back together, to edit things back out, to push and pull. And so there's, always this added element of paint. And in the end, I hope people do come see the show in person, because surface is really important to me. I want it all to coexist and feel sort of locked in a pristine surface that feels believable, so that you can't go up and it doesn't feel like, this thing is going to peel off the canvas. Like it's really embedded in the canvas. And I use a thin coating of wax over the paintings to establish this sort of, I don't know, like
a unified surface.
Yeah, totally.
Do you sometimes print things specifically for inclusion in a painting?
Totally. Like I just did the cactus, both cacti, the one on the right side and the one on the left side, they're woodcuts. So, I already had some like sort of photographic cacti in the back, but I needed some larger cacti. And so I just, as I'm teaching, if I'm doing a demo on woodcut or something, I'll just create that for like one of my demos that I'm teaching my students, and then I'll include it in the painting. So that's how that came about.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Should I move on to
Mary, is it possible? No, please, if you could go back to the previous slide. We have
Okay.
a question for that
Okay.
one specifically.
We also want to get to Phyllis and then have a bunch of questions
Right.
at the end.
Okay.
So we're back to Black Hills.
Okay. An attendee would like to know if this refers to a specific place, an actual place.
Well, kind of. I mean, there is certainly something that you would recognize in the top right-hand corner of the image. It's hard to see, but there is a picture of Mount Rushmore tucked in there, right? So this is the sort of my imagined version of the Black Hills, which is where Mount Rushmore is. I've never been there in person, but it was kind of my idea, sort of, I don't know, a comment on America. It's like, what is a nation except it exists in our minds, right? There is no physical border. There's no, well, now there is actually, there's a wall. But besides the wall, there is no actual demarcation of these things. So it exists in our minds, sort of. And so for me, to create this sort of fictional or this real place, or name it as this real place, and include a little picture of something that actually exists in this imagined place, but make it from all of these pictures of stuff from all around the world, not just America, but there's pictures of Mount Fuji in there that's taken from a life book, so in that way, it's like I'm creating this idea of this place, but it's more this mashup, as Mary was saying, which I think speaks to our time, of all of the sort of globalization that's happening in our world, of all of the cross-pollination that's happening, of all of sort of our perceived differences. I'm trying to really think about everything that we have in common. I mean, we all share this same earth, and whether it's like one particular place, it's connected to everything else, and so that was kind of in my mind when I made this particular piece.
Okay, so we'll move on to the next because I want us to have conversation as a group. So I'm going to go on to this to Stadium, which is a more recent piece than Black Hills. You still have a very strong foreground, middle ground, and background in this. A very kind of recognizable structure. And I love that in the back you see the little sign for Stadium Liquor, which is where you've gotten your title.
Yeah, exactly. The sign. So, it's taken from a picture that I took myself of the liquor store, and, tucked in the background. It's sort of hard to see on the screen, but if you see this piece in real life, it's large. You can walk right up to it. You can see the little pieces of stuff. I was trying to sort of make the figure feel like dwarfed in this room, and the glass of the flowers was also just like a pint glass for me. So this idea of that kind of wrestling with I don't know, the false sense of sort of inspiration that can come from a pint glass. It can feel so beautiful, like it's blooming, like everything's blooming, but it's a sort of a false bloom, I think. And so I kind of tried to sort of pair that with this like cavernous room that feels very empty, and the figure sort of like dwarfed by this like idea.
Right, heroic. It's like a heroic display of flowers.
Yeah.
So, and I've noticed in all of these later pieces, the color is more toned down. And is that by virtue of the materials that you're selecting?
Yeah, more and more I'm sort of just more fascinated with the material, the inherent color of the paper and the scraps that I find. I'm trying to leave them more open. I find that the space is more inviting when it's less prescribed and it's more open-ended. This is kind of like another take on that outskirts painting, which has that sort of really sort of easy to understand 2-point or 1-point perspective that goes back into the background, the highway, but trying to think about it in more of that cubist way of really breaking it down and letting it almost be almost disintegrate into a world of scraps. Maybe what you have left is like the yellow line in the middle of the highway. Sort of this, the space is starting to be there, but it's really broken down, and it becomes a lot more about flatness, a lot more about just the composition. It allows me to just, it allows me to let the materials kind of just do their thing, and me stop trying to sort of bully things into submission.
So I'm gonna run through these fairly quickly. We can always go back, but I want Phyllis to be able to join in on the conversation. And it doesn't mean we're not going to talk anymore. But I thought it was interesting. This atrium piece is sort of the 2-lane highway and stadium combined, because you're implying a physical space, but everything seems to be kind of floating.
Totally. And I play with that. I go back and forth from realism or sort of representation to pure abstraction. And then I try to find that sort of middle space. And that's really an interesting space for me right now. So both of these are kind of interior spaces. They have some sort of sense of space, but then they start to break down and become flat. And there's certainly some floral forms in there that you could identify as having some sort of shape, but they start to just really break down into the ether of the painting.
Great. And then this is the last piece that we have up, and I think you were the last studio visit I was able to do in person. And I think that this was one of the first pieces we saw, and got really into the flowers.
Yeah. Yeah, flowers have been a constant theme for me. I discovered that my love for like trite and overused subject matter in graduate school, and I've just been running with it ever since.
And you were full force.
Yeah, full force.
Great, great. Well, we will be talking more as a group, and I can always go back to these slides. And now I want to introduce Phyllis, also another New Mexico native, which is always great. And when we get to the group conversation, you both at some point left to go to New York and came back. So that gives us something to talk about as well. So let me move forward. And then this is the Phyllis's installation in the gallery. And then Phyllis, you can tell me how you want me to drive. Do you want me to show the first three that show the installation, or?
Yes, I'm going to talk a little bit about my roots in the language of painting and how I've combined many forms of abstraction. And I can start anywhere, but I'd like a little time just to explain where I'm
yeah, please.
Yeah. I create language from many forms of abstraction, like bold gestural brushstroke juxtaposed against line and geometry, color and collage, and have some similar attitudes about collage that Karsten has, which we'll go into later. I have a lot of references to historical movements, abstract expressionism, geometric abstraction, color field, minimalism, but the underpinnings of historical movements are not academic statement of a laundry list for me, but personal. I grew up in southern New Mexico, and on the other hand of the spectrum, I spent probably 13 years in the Bay Area and nearly 30 years in New York City. And these are very different energies. So I've never left, even though I spent all this time in the city, I've never not been in New Mexico a part of the year. And I've never lost touch with the light, the space, the air, the culture, the magic of Mexican retablos, icons, and Navajo rugs, the original geometric abstractionists. And so these things I've experimented in sort of, I think I started paintings with great big gestures. And at some point I thought, okay, but they need some sort of punch. So I would introduce collage pieces of geometric abstraction. And that sort of started me off. In this particular image that you're seeing, I'm simplifying. I'm not using as big gestures. The gestures have almost changed into soft shapes. And color's really primary for me. I have no idea. I think about composition. Color is really intuitive. I just put it together. So
I notice color is often part of your title.
Yes, I sort of force that out first and let something else lead behind it. So we can go into that as we go through. I'm also very experimental in the studio. Intentions and accidents have equal weight for me in the studio. And for the longest time, I would fool around. It was kind of like a diary. I'd have a big scrap laying around and I didn't want to face that white canvas. So I would put all kinds of things on. It would be gestural, it would be geometric, it would be a slurry, it would be a mess, it would be anything. And these things I collected and on a table. And initially, I had no idea really what I was doing at this point, why they were going to fit in and why I was driven to do these very free-form things that were going into this language that I'd already developed, which was very gestural. So finally, I started rifling through this table, kind of like going through a job lot table, looking for another sock or something. and I'd find it and I'd put it in the painting. And so I think, Karsten, it was a good idea for you to show one of your earlier paintings, because I have some early paintings that I guess I showed at David Richard that were combinations of gesture. They even had wire in them, steel wire, that I used for a gray, because it was a really nice gray, I thought. And then there were swirls of drawing in it and everything kind of under the sun. But in a way, the painting was a big painting, a big gesture painting, and the other stuff was kind of falling around like details. And I liked that painting quite a lot, actually. It was one of those paintings that kicks you into what you're doing. So it's an additive process of making a big shape and then separate paint episodes. And they're all were made at different times, which I liked that. The fact that the painting had different moods in it and different times in it. And basically, I guess some of this is like talking about art history, but a lot of it's a collage of me. And if other people can relate to it, that's great. So if you want to just go through, this one is,
Okay.
oh, I keep pointing. The one on the left is called Color Conversation. And
Whoops.
we got a collage piece in the middle that's kind of the brown triangular piece, and the other parts are painted, but I've used a stencil on the yellow part to give it some more busyness or activity, or it's kind of like a swarm going on in there.
Yeah, it's like a honeycomb. And I noticed on the piece next to it, that hard blue line and that lavender shape, you must be using stencil for that too, because you use, I noticed you said you use spray paint or spray in addition to the acrylic paint. So you're doing a spray, I mean, I don't want to describe what you're doing, but I think that's interesting if you want to describe that a little bit.
I make my own stencils. Like that was a leftover, that blue stencil line that goes around was a leftover from a shape that I sprayed. And I thought, that's interesting. So I cut it out, and eventually, that painting took me a long time to resolve, but eventually it ended up in that painting. And the bottom part is got some Neo Geo in it, kind of constructivist stuff at the bottom. And it's called Blue Slant.
Do you want me to go to the next?
We sure can.
Yeah, and then we have details of everything as well. Or not details, but the individual works.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Well, you can move to the next slide.
Okay. So there you can see the hard edge of that shape. It's gorgeous. And then here's the kind of Neo Geo that you were talking about down here.
Yeah, at the bottom.
I had a question for you. You were talking a lot about gesture, and I know that Elmer Bischoff was an influence to you, and he's a very well-known Bay Area figurative abstractionist. And there's no figure or reference to, or maybe I'm just not seeing it, reference to the body here. So I'm wondering if the color is his influence or what.
Well,
And if you did figurative work.
I was very formed when I went back to Berkeley and got my Master's of Fine Arts. I actually had a show at the De Young at the same time I was a graduate student. And I adored Elmer Bischoff. He was just a lovely human being. And I was the TA for him and for Peter Voulkos, which I can't tell you what a large spread that was.
I want to hear about that sometime.
Wonderful. He was a wonderful teacher. He's a wonderful artist. And turned out to be very supportive, good friend.
Oh, that's great. So should I move on to these? Now, these are works that you've made prior to our scheduling the alcove. These are post-COVID works.
Yes, I did a series of COVID paintings called Hold That Line, using a lot of abstract gray with a very hot color line. And I think that's what we're all doing, is holding that line. I mean, maybe we all have different lines we're holding, but we're aware of the restriction.
Right. So, and then I think we have a newer one too.
Yeah.
We've got the individual works here.
The one on the left is called Hold That Line in quotation marks, blue line constraint. And the other one's called Hold That Line, green line constraint. And the interior many of the interiors of these are dark, like the swirl we're in.
Mm-hmm. And you can see beautiful brushwork here. And it goes without saying, all of this work really needs to be seen in person. What's nice about tonight is we get to hear from you guys.
No, I hope everybody will be drawn to see the show.
So, and then we have with some of the works we talked about individually. Here's a color conversation, and there's you can see kind of that swarming area that you were talking about with
this is the Hold the Line one. And this is color conversation.
Yeah. And then this, I obviously put this in, I think, at the wrong place. This is the newest of the Hold That Line series.
It's also a COVID painting. So it goes well. And this I just finished. And it's called Phthalo Blue Line, Hold That Line series, painting in the time of COVID. So it's kind of it seems like I'm getting really interested in the balancing equally of geometry and gesture.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, I change all the time. So if I have a brand, the brand is I create language from many forms of abstraction.
And then Pink Power, and this has that beautiful pink form, just kind of glows. I think you can see it when we showed the overall view of the alcove.
A stronger image in the overall than maybe this by itself. This seems a little tiny bit light, but this I did at the same time as the Women's March. And it's called Pink Power. And the green shape is one of those pieces that I found laying around the studio. And it worked there. So there's a lot of collage. Mm-hmm. But I also use my camera, my iPhone, and I take tons of pictures. And it's not the kind of pictures that anybody would show, their relatives at Thanksgiving or anything. Usually a shape or a negative shape or a shadow or something. And recently I was in, not so recently because I've hardly been out of the house, but I was cruising around in Target, and there was a whole slew of bathing suits of really weird colors on sale. And I got really close and I was photographing some of these mustard and coral and hot pink bathing suits. And the clerk came over and she said, you can try them on. So does she think I'm getting dimensions of the legs?
That's pretty funny.
Phyllis, I have a quick question. In Blue Slant, did you spray first or paint first or no particular order?
I think it came together with paint first. Some of this background is painted. And then I think I ran into this purple shape on the floor. And I just started, it took a long time to put this thing together. But it's really constructed. Most of my stuff has got lots and lots of gestural paint in it. got kind of like a construction.
Something I noticed in both of your work is that there's a lot of layering. Some of it's actual collage, some of it's not. But, and Karsten had mentioned that he puts a wax layer over the surface. But for the amount of layering, it's primarily visual. There's not a huge amount of texture on the surface or an extreme amount of physical surface on the works. You know, they tend to be a fairly consistent surfaces, you know, relative to, say, a very Baroque, thick painting.
Not to load it way up, because if I don't like it, it's too cumbersome, sort of. So my surfaces have dimension, but they're fairly flat. And like Karsten, I don't use wax, but I sometimes put a layer of resin on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great, great. Well,
I'm curious to see your paintings in person, Phyllis, when I haven't been up to see the show yet. So I really am curious about, you know, yeah, that physical surface. For me, I like when there's lots of layers that you can see, but you can't necessarily like feel them, or you can't see them, but well, you can see them, but you can't actually like see the edges of stuff. So
Yeah.
there's that sort of tension there where it's flat and it's sort of pristine, but then there's a lot going on. So it really becomes like a window.
Well,
But
when there's so much going on, I think the tendency might be to make the surface uniform, to just
yeah,
sort of give the person an hourglass to kind of look at.
yeah, for me, there's a calming effect that happens with like that, because my paintings are much busier than yours. You know, I feel like I need that sort of pristine
Yeah.
surface to kind of like calm everything down.
mm-hmm.
The
So
last
we have,
time that you showed, Mary showed a painting that I could certainly see your constructivist cubist influence, the one that you said has maybe a yellow line from the street.
Yeah.
And I've been using lots of yellow lines thinking about the streets lately.
oops,
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
There's that piece. Maybe what I'll do is stop sharing the screen, and then all of us can be on screen having a conversation. And then if you want me to pull up a particular image, I will. How does that sound?
Okay. That sounds
So, and we had a question about if the works are preconceived when you start working on them, or do they develop themselves?
talking to me.
To either of you, both of you.
Mine aren't really very preconceived.
Mine are totally not preconceived.
I wish they were.
I had assumed kind of as much for both of you, and because especially Karsten, your titles tend to come from text in the work. So clearly, unless you modeled it all out ahead of time, those titles were coming from the completed piece.
No, part of what I find really inspiring is sort of go on an adventure, right? I don't know where I'm going to end up. I sort of find sort of my way. I mean, there's a certain part in the beginning where I'm just slapping stuff on there and just waiting to sort of find a direction or a path to go down. And then once I'm going down that path, like things are a little bit more fixed. I know what I like. I know what maybe needs to change. And so then it sort of evolves from there. But I don't have a preconceived, you know, and you know, I maybe that comes from maybe some of my own shortcomings, you know, in that like I've never considered myself like a really stellar draftsman, for example. Like I can't, like I don't have it all in my head. And you know, something that you said, Phyllis, that you said that, you know, it's equal parts intention and action. And I think that, you know, even though I wind up sometimes with something that's very sort of recognizable in those more figurative forms, like I really find that space. And so I'm curious, like, how does that work for you? this sort of play between intention, like what you sort of see in your mind, and then action or maybe reaction to what sort of you find. Like, how does that work for you?
Well, the intention part, I think, is I'm working with abstract vocabulary,
Mm-hmm.
and that's come before me and it's there for me, kind of.
Uh-huh.
It's accidents are big. I like accidents. I like to find accidents. Like just the other day, I have sprayed these pieces of paint and it's left marks all over my floor. I have a great floor and it has thousands of different shapes on it. And I was sitting there staring at it. And then all of a sudden I look over and one of these really big shapes is laying on it. And there's a piece of tape because I taped off an area at one time to show some little sculptures or something. And I thought, that's a painting,
Yeah.
you know, that's done.
Yeah. I totally relate to that.
And it's like completely, I mean, I guess a lot of people would hire the painters and say, roll it, you know, get rid of all this stuff. But that's stuff happens and I'm open to it.
So it's kind of like cultivating this sort of openness within yourself to sort of embrace the accident or sort of look for it, or
Yeah.
something that somebody else might just completely glance over.
And maybe sometimes I should. I mean,
No, I don't think so. I mean, everything that you showed tonight has been beautiful. So I think you're doing a pretty good job.
I do say something.
Our abstract painters, and we're additive. We look at the image and we go, well, what does it need? Is there anything there? There's something there, but it needs something here. I mean, you know, this is like an AE process.
So on that note,
So I
we
have
have
a question.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Phillis.
sorry.
Go ahead, Carol.
Both of you use acrylic paint, which can be dull compared to oil. Does the wax and resin help you bring a polish or a more vivid feeling to the piece?
Yes. For me, when I assume that question is posed to me because I use the wax. For me, yes, there is this dulling effect that happens with acrylic paint. And then there's also like a shininess that happens with some of the found materials that I use. If it's a more recent publication that I'm like tearing up, sometimes the paint is, or the page is actually kind of glossy. And so there's competing surfaces. So what the wax does is it kind of, it actually is this beautiful sort of medium.
Yeah.
Is that it kind of dulls the super shiny stuff and it kind of heightens the color of the dull stuff. So it kind of like unifies the surface, and it allows that you're not sort of stuck on the surface of stuff, like actually sensing the flatness of the picture plane, but that you can actually go into it, and it allows you to suspend your disbelief there. Because when something's sort of catching your eye and it sort of says, it's screaming like I'm a fragment that's stuck on and not really sort of belonging, that bothers me. I want it to feel like a fragment so that you can see it like, oh, that's cut out. But I also want it to feel embedded, feel like it's integral, feel like it belongs.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so how do you both know when you're finished? Your pieces are very complicated. So when do you stop?
Well, it's if something looks back at me, and it doesn't have to be pretty.
Right.
It's just, it's kind of like a friend. You might be friends with somebody who, you know, wears their clothes backwards or something. But when you sit with them and you talk to them, you really like them. And they have character, and that's, I mean, I destroy things that sometimes I make big mistakes, but if nothing's there that sort of rings a bell, I don't leave it.
Yeah.
So Phyllis, another question for you. Have there been other external issues besides COVID that have influenced your work?
My whole life. No, well, I mean, growing up in southern New Mexico and spending probably 30 some odd years going in and out of New York City, and all of it's a big potpourri of who I am and how I draw images from that. I mean, I guess it all sort of, I guess when you're working abstractly and you're using the language of abstraction, you can pull it together so that it has certain meanings if you're going through hell or you're happy or what, you know. I don't know if I answered your question at all.
I think you have. Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
So something that I really appreciated about the Alcove format is all the artists got a chance to meet each other in person, usually when we were installing or we would have these talks in the breakfast. So I'm glad you guys could talk together, and I hope you will get to meet in person, because there's definitely, maybe you can exchange scraps of paper. It sounds like you both leave things around the studio for inspiration, or find things in the studio that are your inspiration.
Exchange piles.
That sounds like a great idea. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Phyllis, you have a very unusual degree in counseling. How has that experience as a counselor affected your work?
Well, I thought I would be a counselor because, well, I have a psychological orientation anyway, and I have a undergraduate degree in counseling and English and psychology and art, all of that. So those are all kind of related. And I also write short stories. So I'm interested in people. And I was interested in myself because my background wasn't so easy. And I think a lot of people go into counseling to give themselves permission to go to a shrink, which I did. But I enjoyed it when I did it. And I used it. My ex-husband and I were Vista volunteers, and I used it a lot counseling the children of migrants in California, because we were working with the Cesar Chavez Gallet wine thing that was going on. So I have used it, but after I kind of settled down, I rented a studio, and that was it. I just was drawn to renting a studio. And then I got very involved in the women's group in San Francisco, and we were all very, very supportive of each other.
Mm-hmm.
So
Great.
It's been a
Thank you.
kind of a circular journey.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I don't see any more questions. Should we, great conversation. Look forward to seeing the work in person from Amy Ellingson, who's going to be on our next webinar. So I think maybe it's a good time to begin to say thank you to both of you, and to also encourage people to come see the show, and to thank everybody that Carol thanked for getting this going. And then I know we have some other business that we need to do. So I will, I guess, Kristen, are you going to take over the screen now?
Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. It has been such a great pleasure. I can't wait to go see the exhibition in person. And it's been great to have a mini version of the gallery conversation. Please mark your calendars for April 6th at 5:30 p.m. Amy Ellingson and Deborah Baxter. So I think that's it for tonight. Unless we have anything else happening here, I think that's about it. We did get some great kudos, Mary.
Thank you to Mary and Carol and Karsten. I enjoyed being with you tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been great.
Second that. I really and I'm honored to be included. It was great to talk to you tonight, Phyllis, and hope to see you guys in person soon.
Yes, me too.
Yeah, we're getting tons and tons of thank yous and kudos and applause for tonight's program. So thank you so very much, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you to the whole staff at the New Mexico Museum of Art. It's really been
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you so much for the hard work and for making it work in this crazy time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Take care.
Highlight of this isolation and to see your faces.
Yes.
That in and of itself.
Great. Well, thank you all. And I think we're signed off, but I'm not sure. But I'll talk to both of you, I'm sure, independently.
Okay.
Okay.